Well, so today I'm going to talk about Okteto, Crossplane, and how you can use them both together to create a dev flow that spans both cloud and Kubernetes services. Before I start, hi everyone, as Dan said, I'm Ramiro. I'm one of the co-founders of Okteto. I used to be an architect at Atlassian as part of the HipChat enterprise team. And before that, I used to be a software engineer at Microsoft Azure. If you want to connect later, you can find me as Berrelleza in GitHub, Twitter, and most other social media. So as we all know, building cloud native applications is hard, right? Even a simple application like this, where you have your app and it has a database, it really, if you look deep into it, it has a lot of components, right? You have to deal with load balancers, ingresses, services, pods, and then you go to like databases, VPCs, all those things. It's really a lot of work that a developer needs to grasp. And this has created a lot of challenges for devs. The first one, and this is one of the things that kind of took us a while to understand, is that cloud native applications are now heterogeneous, right? They kind of span VMs, Kubernetes, cloud services, third-party APIs, functions, and a lot of different things. Second challenge that we start to see with a lot of teams is that your application now doesn't really fit in your local machine anymore, and this makes it a little bit harder to develop. You can no longer spin up, a local environment, Docker Compose up, and have everything up and running. And this has the problem where then you end up with a situation where dev, CI, and prod, they are different. Each of them has its own set of manifests, its own way of running, which its own issues and particularities, which introduces a lot of skew between dev and prod. Fourth is now developers have this huge cognitive load where they have to think of all these different things, right? All the way from what network do I deploy this on, which version of database, as Kelsey and Brendan mentioned before, which policy do I have to agree with? And finally, all of this results in a very slow feedback cycle, which is something that developers really hate because it really affects our productivity, our creativity, and just the joy we get out of building software. Especially for us, when we started Okteto, we really saw an inner loop full of friction. It really makes it super hard to develop. And for us, it's like the number one problem that we wanted to tackle and help solve for the broader community. We want people to go away from this, where you have to write code, build a container, push an image, then deploy it, then write a test, and then see your code, to something like this, where you can very easily write code, build it, and test it, but without losing the fidelity and the trust you have that your work code is going to work on dev, on CI, and on prod, but you're having to do tests on every single of these stages. So that's where Okteto came into the picture. Okteto is an open source project. It's Apache 2. It's straight up on GitHub. And it's a tool to make it easier to build applications directly in Kubernetes. The core idea with Okteto is that instead of thinking of dev as your local machine and then production as something that runs in the cluster, you really think of your application as your dev environment. You're going to be using the same scripts, the same manifests, and the same platform on dev, on CI, and on prod to make it easier to dev, quicker, and to give you all this trust that your code will work. No more works on my machine, it might work on the cluster kind of situation. So I'm going to give you a demo of how Crossplane and Okteto work together to create this dev environments that are very flexible and easy to use. So for this demo, what I'm going to show you is that app I showed you. It's a very simple app. It's a Go app that gives you there's a guestbook example from Kubernetes that I make some changes to make it use Crossplane's database capabilities. So the first thing I did, and I'll show you here on my setup is, and this is a really cool feature that you haven't used it yet, I create a composition of databases, VPCs, subnets, everything you need to run a RDS instance in AWS in a production-like setup. You have your subnet groups, your gateway, the routing table, the whole thing. And to make it a more application-like, I added a couple of things. One is you can define your own storage. The other is you can define your DB name. This is the same sample that is posted on Crossplane's docs. I just made a couple more changes. And then I created my offering. In this case, it's called PostgreSQL Instance. So this makes my app look like this, right? It's an application that has my requirement for my Postgres instance. In this case, I'm asking for 5 GBs of storage, a database named guestbook. I'm creating a service account with a role binding. In this case, I'm just assigning cluster admin for demo purposes. Please don't do this in production. This is just for this demo. It creates an ingress. In this case, the ingress is going to go to guestbook.sf, okteto.net, service, and a deployment finally that has an image. And you know, all these really cool things about Kubernetes. In this case, I'm going to do this demo with a Kubernetes manifest, but this could be anything. It could be Helm, it could be OAM, CNAP. It doesn't really matter. It's just how you deploy your application. And finally, I'm mounting the secrets that Crossplane will create for me as an environment variable. So I went ahead and already deployed this app before, just so we didn't have to wait the 5 minutes it takes to deploy the app. But it's the guestbook app. You can check the environment. It exposes certain things, so it's running Kubernetes, hostname, port, and all those things. So now, as a developer, when I'm working with Okteto and with Crossplane, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my own namespace. In this case, what I did is I created a namespace called devtime. And I deployed this application there. So I have a copy of my application. Because I'm using Crossplane, I'm also getting a copy of the cloud infrastructure, which is as close to production as it can be. For this demo, I'm doing it simple. As a database, you could run something locally. But once you get to more complex things, once you have policies like OPA, once you have a more complex setup on the cloud side, it starts to make more sense to use these kind of things on the cloud. So now that I'm here, the second step is how to develop. And that's where Okteto comes into the picture. With Okteto, you can define what we call a dev environment, which is an image that you're gonna tell via Okteto to replace a piece of your application with this Docker container, with the idea you can develop directly on the cloud. It's a simple command, Okteto up, and in this case, namespace devtime. While this runs, I'm going to show you, what it looks like. It looks like it's an image. In this case, I'm asking for extra capabilities, CSP trace, because I want to be able to run a debugger, and some ports, and I have some information on how to build. The cool part about this is that Okteto is using a container-based dev environment. You can reuse all the things you had in production. In this case, I have this image that for dev, I'm installing kubectl, I'm installing the Postgres client, a hot reloader for Go, a debugger, I'm building my application, and then that is the same container I'm using to build my Go app and to deploy it. So when I'm going for production, I'm using the prod stage of my Docker build, but when I'm on dev, I'm going to use this dev one. So it's same Docker image, different stages, one builds on top of the other. What that gives me is this dev environment that is running on my cluster, where everything is already installed for me. For instance, I already have the right Go version installed. I have kubectl already installed there because I need it. And the other thing is because Okteto is replacing your container with your dev environment, you will inherit all the same settings you had in your application. If you remember, I created this this cluster admin role for my application. That was so that I can do things like this directly from a dev environment. I can see my pods. I could even do things like create more resources if I need it. So we have a dev environment fully configured. I can put in my database directly. If you notice, I didn't have to pass the password, username, or host, because everything is already coming pre-configured on my dev environment, in this case by using nvars. So then let's get to the development part. First thing, I'm going to start my application. I'm going to use my hot reloader. I'm using Fresh, which is a hot reloader for Go. Now, let me exit Postgres and then Go. And this is going to get the code and run it. One other thing that Okteto does for you is it will synchronize the code as you write it from your local machine to your remote dev environment and on the way back. This means that you can still write code locally, use your local IDE, but you're going to see all the results on your cluster. So here, I'm going to go back to this app, and you see that this app is still up and running. But now, if you look at these logs, it's hooked up to my dev environment and to my IDE. So for instance, if I go here, and let's say I'm going to change the title to my guestbook, I'm going to save it. As soon as I'm going to save it, Okteto will synchronize the files. The hot reloader on my dev environment will pick it up, and I'm going to be able to see some changes. That's cool. I changed a string, no big deal, but let's do something a bit more interesting. In this case, let's enable the database utilization for this app. Right now, the app, if you notice, I can type something and nothing happens, right? The DB code is not hooked up yet. So we're going to do that. In this case, first thing I did, so right here, I'm connecting to a database. I'm inheriting the environment user password and database. This is the database that Crossplane provision on AWS with the right VPC, the right security settings, all that. So as a developer, I'm going to enable the get and the read. I already wrote the code. Very simple. I'm just going to insert the message when I get it. When I get it from my request, the submit, and then I have another one for get. And if you notice, I'm writing code as if I was locally. I'm not dealing with any Kubernetes, any containers, any push, nothing. I just save my file. I go back here. I can refresh it, and you'll see. I'll save it, and you see now it's appearing. Hello. And you see it's there. And it's all working instantly. So at this point, I know that my code works, in this case, through an ingress. It's using SSL because I have my cluster configured that way. It's using a database and all those things. So I could go here, and I can say SQL, and you'll see everything. Yes. And you see the messages are there on my database. I don't have to install anything locally. I don't have to arrange for special network rules, nothing. I just deploy my application as it was in production. I can just easily develop. And at this point, I'm ready to submit my code, send a PR, let it go through the CI/CD cycle. And I know it's going to work on production because I tested it on an environment that is as close as possible to it. And just to finalize, and everything here it's online, it's on GitHub. I'll share the link later if you want to try it out. This is what we had originally. It's what my app looks like. I'm using Crossplane to provision my database. I'm using, in this case, plain Kubernetes manifest to deploy my application. And again, this could be a Helm chart. This could be CNAB. It doesn't really matter from Okteto's perspective or from the DevFlow perspective. What you want is to be able to have an artifact your developers can deploy in their own namespace that will provision everything they need, so they don't have to think about it in a realistic way, so they can focus on developing. And when you enable Okteto up, this is what happens. You see that Okteto will replace your pod for your dev-m. Everything else is the same. It will do port forwarding. It will do file synchronization, which means you can do things like access ports locally. You could expose your local debugger. I had it on the demo, but I didn't have time to show it, but it's there. You want to try it out. You can develop as if you were on your local environment, but directly on Kubernetes, and you're taking advantage of Crossplane's resource provisioning, Kubernetes, flexibility. I'm able to spin up my application really quickly with the speed of an immediate dev flow. Instead of having to wait for Docker to build, push, and update my deployments, I'm getting instant feedback, which for me is one of the most important things when building an application. So what do you gain by using Okteto and Crossplane together? You get quick onboarding for your entire team for your application. You have parity across dev, CI, and production. You get a pre-configured dev environment. You have an instant feedback loop, and you get to keep your favorite IDE, debugger, and any other tool. And Okteto works with any Kubernetes, anything that is Kubernetes, remote clusters, local, operators, Helm, use a Crossplane, even functions. If you go to our blog, it's linked here. We have a lot of examples of how to use Okteto, and it's there. It's an open source repo, so you just go to Okteto. You can see some samples there as well, and our blog, okteto.com/blog, where we post a lot of how to use Okteto and other cloud native technologies together to make it simple. And if you want to talk more about this, I'm on the Crossplane community. I'm also on the Slack. We have a Okteto channel there if you want to talk more about it. And please, it's an open source project. We're always looking for ideas, collaboration, feedback, issues. So go to github.com/Okteto and help us improve the dev experience for cloud native applications. That's it. Thank you.